Action roguelikes are getting more and more popular, and in recent years, a new subgenre started making an appearance, populating the Steam store as well as mobile app stores very quickly. A genre defined by its minimal mechanics and very satisfying gameplay, known as bullet heavens or vampire survivor clones. And after playing hundreds of hours of over 30 different bullet heavens, I've decided to make a video talking about the simple yet interesting design of these games and give my thoughts as to what I think makes a good bullet heaven game. First, I'd like to quickly explain what a bullet heaven even is. Bullet heaven is another branch of the action roguelike genre. In short, it is defined by a couple of elements: fighting hordes of enemies while having extremely simple gameplay, and mostly automated attacks all bundled up in fast-paced, short runs. All things considered, the bullet heaven definition is clearly a bit more specific than many other genres such as first-person shooters, 2D platformers, which is also why the term bullet heaven is inherently a bit confusing. While bullet hells are defined by having large quantities of bullets players need to avoid, bullet heavens is the opposite in a way, in which players are the ones sending waves of bullets at enemies. I personally myself am not a huge fan of this title, since the concept of players being the ones sending hells of bullets is in my eyes what defines the genre, which is why I personally like calling them Hordelikes, a mixture of the term roguelike with the word horde, which in my eyes is one of its defining elements, and what I will be calling them throughout the video. Not to mention it kind of rolls off the tongue better, but that's besides the point. Even if some dislike the term, I think it's important for new genres or subgenres of games to have an identity, so people can easily find those specific games they enjoy. At the time of recording this video, the term bullet heaven is still not fully embraced. Regardless of whether this name will stick or not, the genre still lacks the bullet heaven or any appropriate tag on Steam. This means that there isn't an easy way to find these games outside of just looking through similar games of this genre. And the reason why people may be looking for these bullet heavens or Hordelikes is thanks to the game that started this new trend: Vampire Survivors in early 2022. Now, whether Vampire Survivors was the first true bullet heaven is kind of up to debate. Some say games such as Magical Survival or Crimson Land were first, but Vampire Survivors was the first to really bring this niche genre to the light and start this new independent gaming trend we've been seeing the last few years. At first, without a clear indication of a new genre being born, games that were using similar designs were simply called Vampire Survivor clones, which is still being used to this day. Outside of just how enjoyable and simple Vampire Survivor was, Hordelikes are also very simple to actually make. While the genre might be fairly specific, its design is straightforward with overall minimalistic enemy design, level design, and mechanics. With the focus mostly being around satisfying visuals and big numbers, it doesn't take much to make a bullet heaven when compared to most other genres. On one end, this means that most are cheap games to purchase, which is great considering that high-quality Hordelikes can keep a player engaged for many hours thanks to the inherent replayability of roguelikes. It's easy to get your money's worth. On the other hand, its simple design can allow bulk releases of fairly mediocre quality Hordelikes, especially in the mobile world. It's easy to see why this genre would be attractive to the mobile industry. But while this genre might be on the simpler side to create, this doesn't mean that there aren't great Hordelikes out there, and standing out in this new ocean of games can be challenging. So, with that out of the way, let's dive deeper into the actual design of these games. Generally, when playing a smaller game, it's best to give the player a simple goal. In the case of Hordelikes, given that runs last 15 to 40 minutes on average, regardless of having a powerful build, reaching the end of the run is usually the one and only goal, no matter the method used. In my experience, there are two distinct paths leading to this goal. I like to call them wave or time-based Hordelikes. Wave-based Hordelikes are games that split a run into multiple distinct waves, only lasting a few seconds up to a couple of minutes, with a shopping phase in between each one. Instead of trying to survive a long period of time, the goal here is to beat a certain number of short but frenetic waves. They usually split runs between intense, non-interrupted gameplay and shopping phases where the player can then take a breather and focus on what to purchase or upgrade before getting back to the hectic gameplay. Designing a wave-based Hordelike is generally trickier since the developers need to make sure that the sudden breaks in gameplay aren't too abrupt and that the shopping sections aren't too boring in comparison. With how short the waves tend to be, especially in the early game, It's important that these short bursts of action don't take too long to get rolling. We don't want players waiting around for no more than a couple of seconds, waiting for enough enemies to spawn, considering that they'll be repeatedly doing so every few minutes after each shopping section. In God of Weapons, I may spend upwards of 3 full minutes in the shopping phase, figuring out the best way to utilize my currency, then start a new wave and be completely surrounded by enemies no more than 10 seconds into the wave. By the end of the wave, I would be keeping a close eye on the timer, knowing that I will soon be back to safety before getting completely overwhelmed. This is generally why wave-based Hordelikes tend to be much faster and hectic in order to minimize the amount of waiting around at the start of a new wave. Since each wave tends to be very quick, developers have the opportunity to exponentially increase the amount of enemies on screen much faster, creating a sense of true chaos before being saved by the end of the wave bell. This constant back and forth and difficulty creates a consistent feeling of intensity and engagement that isn't as easy to replicate in time-based Hordelikes. Shopping phases, as previously stated, can be a bit of an abrupt stop from everything else. Instead of just choosing one upgrade or one item, players are usually offered many options to choose from. Utilizing whichever currency they've been able to collect during their last wave, they can acquire multiple upgrades or items, as well as usually being able to reroll their options endlessly for a fee in order to search for specific items and combinations. This section is a lot more thought-provoking than time-based Hordelikes, as it has many more options than simply choosing one of a few options. The choice to purchase many items, the choice to reroll for a chance of better selections, the choice to buy minimal items to save more currency for the next shopping phase. The fact that there are so many options may make these Hordelikes a bit less casual than others, whether that is a good or a bad thing. But with the constant abrupt change of pace after each wave, it's important to make sure that the shopping phase is as quote-unquote enjoyable as the action sections, as to not constantly hinder the pacing of the run. Confining an entire run into multiple bursts of progressively increasing intense fast action with slow, thought-provoking shopping phases is in my opinion much more tricky to design and balance. But I'd say only about 20% of Hordelikes are wave-based. The other large majority is what I like to categorize as time-based Hordelikes. Here, the goal is to survive an endless wave of enemies up to a certain amount of time before facing an end boss, winning the run, or in some cases moving on to the next level. Naturally, the pacing tends to be a bit different, with runs usually taking longer before getting very chaotic with a more linear progression. Instead of having 2 separate sections, here there aren't really any breaks from the action other than when getting an upgrade. In most cases, defeating enemies will drop experience points or some sort of collectible that will allow the player to grow in power. This offers a choice of commonly 3 possible upgrades to improve the build. These occur very frequently, especially in the early game, sometimes 5 to 7 a minute, in order to create interesting gameplay as quickly as possible, considering that early game Hordelikes tend to be very simple and basic. Quick acquisition of certain abilities and upgrades early on allow players to start building towards certain builds fairly quickly. Even though a pop-up window halting the action may feel like a drastic change in pacing, the fact that there aren't many options to choose from, while many being fairly simple to read and understand, doesn't usually hinder the pacing too much. In most cases, these level ups can be a nice short breather between the chaos. But that may not always be the case. Even in my favorite time-based Hordelikes, I can occasionally get tired of constantly leveling up in quick succession when gathering large quantities of experience points, constantly halting my run. I think trying to balance giving enough upgrades to keep players engaged while also not bombarding players with upgrades to minimize sudden halts in pacing is challenging, especially while also making sure that these upgrades don't end up feeling meaningless if constantly given in large quantities, something that wave-based Hordelikes don't need to worry about as much. But whether a Hordelike is wave or time-based, the gameplay will usually always look fairly similar from one another. Let's talk actual controls. Hordelikes have some of the simplest gameplay of any action games out there, as the focus is on simplicity and satisfying chaos. At its simplest form, a Hordelike may just use cardinal movement and nothing else, which is actually the case with Vampire Survivors, allowing players to walk around with no aiming and no other controls other than picking new power-ups for a simpler yet satisfying experience. An easy addition is to add the ability to aim certain automatic attacks, such as the lightning beam in Soulstone Survivors, adding a bit more player engagement to the gameplay. Although I'd say this isn't necessarily as impactful as it may first sound like, as these games tend to get very chaotic quickly, sometimes rendering this feature close to pointless, which is why some games like Potato allow this feature to be enabled as an option instead, something I encourage most Hordelikes to add if possible. Some players may simply not want the ability to aim and just use automation to keep their games simple and easygoing, without it actually hindering the gameplay much, thanks to the player always being surrounded by enemies. Another common gameplay addition is the ability to dodge. Whether it be a dash, a roll, a teleport, many Hordelikes have been adding this option for players to escape from immediate danger. This simple addition can be quite impactful, generally making these Hordelikes more intense as players are now expected to be dodging scary attacks or situations. Games such as Death Must Die feature quick boss attacks players need to react to that cannot be evaded without the use of a dodge. These dodge moves are generally always correlated with the overall pacing of the game. Some games may have just a single slow and short dash on a fairly long cooldown, while others may have multiple ones usable in quick succession. Both are acceptable designs depending on how fast-paced the developers want their Hordelikes to be. A game where players can constantly dash in quick succession is likely going to have much faster enemy attacks and overall gameplay. Considering that many of these games may have the dash as their only secondary movement option, making sure that ability is smooth, satisfying with the right amount of speed and distance, the right amount of invincibility frames, and visual feedback is in my opinion more important than for any other action genre. The last common additional gameplay mechanic is the activation ability, generally on a cooldown which can take many forms. These additions are a way to add a bit more player interaction without adding too much complexity, as most of these are usually on longer cooldowns and tend to be simple button presses for a close to automatic effect. Examples include creating a clone of yourself for a limited amount of time in Repetendium, using your character's inherent ability in Vampire Hunters, such as the Scout's Blood Rush, letting you lunge forward and instantly killing any enemy along your path. Using a consumable black hole in Picayune Dreams, destroying enemies and bullets around the player, but with limited uses. While these may take many forms, they don't tend to be part of the core gameplay or mechanics of these games, usually just small inclusions to spice up runs every few minutes or so with another simple, satisfying action. Considering that most Hordelikes are inherently very simple to play and understand, it's generally important for players to feel powerful quickly as to not have this simple gameplay get too boring too quickly. Big numbers and visual chaos is a core part of these games, so getting there quickly is crucial. That being said, in my eyes, the trickiest part of developing these games is balancing being powerful while still needing to be careful. For instance, when I play Potato, the game is constantly going back and forth in intensity, where one wave may be very challenging, keeping me at the edge of my seat until I survive long enough to buy critical items that let me sweep the next wave with ease, but not long before I start feeling behind on power level again, and the cycle continues. While in the game Goobers, when I first started playing, I often found myself in one of two situations. Either I was not powerful enough early on, leading to fights that could last over 5 minutes as I slowly chipped away at their health while constantly dodging an ever-growing horde of enemies, or I would become overpowered very quickly, which made the mid-game feel unchallenging and ultimately a bit boring, as nothing really seemed to matter anymore. There's no denying that feeling overpowered is an amazing feeling in video games, especially in games meant to make you feel powerful. But to me, the best Hordelikes are the ones where getting powerful feels earned after choosing the right upgrades and surviving long enough, or ones where the difficulty is consistent while still raining more and more chaos throughout a run. Spending the first few minutes in Halls of Torment, slowly building a late-game build, at first feeling weak, running past most enemies, overwhelmed, but grabbing every single experience points possible along the way, leading me to finally have my build rolling and now proceeding to decimate everything, has been one of the most satisfying feelings playing these games. Or once again with Potato, where even though players can pretty consistently get strong, they are usually always somewhat challenged by the very fast-paced enemies, keeping the action fun and intense at all times no matter how good of a run they may have. This doesn't mean that getting a crazy powerful run without much effort and easily winning a run can't be fun, but I think a game that gives these broken runs consistently can run the risk of getting tiring too quickly. If so, I'd rather just be playing an idle game. When it comes to the randomly generated elements of Hordelikes, most of it is in the actual upgrades and items found. In order to keep runs interesting from one another, diversity is pretty important. When collecting enough experience or going to a shop, the player will have access to 3 different kinds of upgrades. The first are the actual attacks. These tend to be the most important quote-unquote upgrades, but always have a limited amount that can be acquired at once. These can take many forms, such as a weapon, spells, ability, or heck, even minions summoned from the grave. These are the player's main offensive abilities that will trigger automatically. This means that most other upgrades tend to focus on making these attacks stronger. When beginning a run, the player will generally always start with one of these attacks to start chipping away at enemies from the very beginning. In most cases, attacks tend to be a priority to acquire since they are the core of a player's offense, but they will generally be limited to a maximum of, say, 4 to 8 or so depending on the game. Although there are some games that can limit the player to just a single attack and instead really focus on the other upgrade types to create a full build. In either case, one thing I've noticed is that it's important to keep these attacks simple at first in order to give them room to grow and evolve throughout a run thanks to other upgrades. For instance, 20 Minutes Till Dawn's Revolver starts off very simple but becomes a monstrous ability that looks and feels drastically different by the end of the run thanks to all the other passive upgrades the player collected. On the other hand, Vampire Hunter's Revolver to me kind of looks and feels the same from start to end, which in my eyes doesn't make my overall choice of weapon in this game feel as impactful or particularly interesting. One satisfying addition to attacks is the ability to evolve them, usually closer to the late game portion of a run. Instead of just adding more and more attacks, many Hordelikes may give the player the ability to evolve a currently owned attack into a much stronger version of itself. By then, players will likely already have a build with synergies, meaning that when these enhancements occur, they get to experience seeing these much more powerful attacks fuse with all of their already owned upgrades for a very satisfying, often game-changing moment, which can definitely help keep runs exciting even after having gathered most of their build already. The second upgrade is what I like to call mechanical upgrades. These are upgrades and items that add more unique mechanics and effects to a build without they themselves being attacks. These can be adding status effects to attacks, triggering certain effects upon defeating an enemy, or even adding new specific effects to an already owned attack, such as most upgrades in Blood Dome 99. For instance, if the player has the bee gun, they may find upgrades such as fire an extra 10 bees every 5 seconds when you're stationary, or firing 3 additional bees every 10 meters you travel and every time you dash, adding more diversity to the player's attack. Surprisingly enough, outside of the specific attack upgrades we just mentioned, mechanical upgrades are generally the least important of the 3 upgrades, which doesn't tend to be the case in most action roguelikes. They're usually a bit more separate from attacks and are generally more standalone effects that may not always be as synergetic. Speaking of, the last upgrade is by far the most common of upgrades, which I like to call numerical upgrades. This is where a majority of the genre's identity relies. These upgrades are simple and focus on stats number increase, such as attack speed, damage, resistances, movement speed. In general, I'm not much of an advocate for action roguelikes to have a majority of upgrades be simple numerical increase upgrades, as they can be pretty boring. But for a Hordelike, this is completely different, as it is the main way to scale and create satisfying chaos without having to worry too much about strategy. While these upgrades may first look boring, they occur so often that they tend to feel like a satisfying filler in between attacks and mechanical upgrades. Getting a 10% attack speed followed by a flat damage increase and a 20% area of effect increase in less than a minute can turn any underwhelming attack into a much more threatening ability. Now one question though is, what should these values be? I've seen games where one attack speed increase may be 5%, while others may be 20%. That range can depend on a few things, such as how fast the overall pacing is and how often developers want to give upgrades. But it can also depend on how chaotic a game wants to be. The bigger the number, the more chaotic it'll tend to be, which on one hand can be very satisfying, but on the other can make balancing much trickier and potentially polarizing, where players either feel overpowered or underpowered. Some games may have players end up with 25 upgrades by the end of a run, while others may be closer to 100. One additional factor that may impact those numbers are potential upgrade rarities. Many Hordelikes will have certain upgrades be of different kinds of rarities, meaning that one attack speed upgrade could be 5% or 20%, depending on whether that upgrade is common or rare. Rarity options in any roguelike is not uncommon, especially after Hades brought even more attention to that concept. But in general, I do find upgrade rarities to be a nice addition to most Hordelikes in order to make certain upgrade choices more enjoyable. Instead of always having to pick one of 3 even power upgrades throughout a run, having the occasional rare option appear can be a satisfying turn of events. Rarer upgrades can not only be in the form of higher stats, but can also be an attack or a mechanical upgrade that would not be obtainable as a common rarity. For instance, Skill Chain in Soulstone Survivors is a legendary mechanical upgrade that reads, whenever you cast a skill of type electric, you have a chance of casting another one of your skills with type ice instantly. This effect is naturally very powerful and is therefore only available as a legendary power, even though most other powers in this game can be of variant rarities otherwise. In Rotato, the sniper gun is a powerful gun that can be acquired, but only as a 3rd level weapon, making it impossible to find in the early game no matter how lucky of a run you may have. Rarities are a simple way to adjust balance more efficiently in Hordelikes, as it gives more room for developers to not need every single upgrade to be of even power levels otherwise. The catch, though, is to ensure that players don't simply always choose the upgrades with the highest rarity level at all times, simply because of their increased power level. If higher rarity upgrades consistently provide more power, regardless of the situation, it could diminish the significance of player choices. Balancing the occurrence rate of these rarities, the amount of upgrade received, as well as their values require a lot of testing and constant adjusting of numbers during playtest. So those are the main 3 upgrades, but that doesn't mean that each game needs to have all of them. As previously mentioned, 20 Minutes Till Dawn doesn't have new attacks other than the starting weapon, and uses a lot more mechanical upgrades to enhance the one weapon. Slime 3K doesn't really have any number increase upgrades, and instead focuses on getting many weapons that can be fused together for increased stats altogether. As long as players are regularly getting some kind of upgrade and can quickly feel strong, that is what's most important in my eyes when making a fun Hordelike. As a quick side note before moving forward, one detail that I personally love and strongly recommend every game to implement are end game stats. Considering that there is so much going on screen at all times, it can sometimes be pretty hard to know how powerful certain abilities, upgrades, or attacks actually are. But giving this information at the end of a run can help players know what combination worked and what upgrades were weak for their build. This, to me, is crucial for letting players understand why a certain build worked and potentially why it may not have. It also personally gives me something else to look forward to at the end of a run, seeing those big total numbers in their entirety. Hordelikes are inherently repetitive in nature, and one of the many ways to make sure a game doesn't get dull after a few hours is through meta progression. A lot of these are similar to other roguelike genres, but in general I'd say roughly 90% of Hordelikes have some sort of meta progression. While it can be very entertaining destroying hundreds of enemies, sometimes without even touching the keyboard anymore, having an actual goal and reason to finish a run beyond simply getting a victory screen is generally welcomed. There are 2 kinds of meta progression. I call them unlockables and enhancements. Unlockables are very common and allow players to unlock new content in the game permanently as a reward for playing. These range from new characters, new weapons to start off with prior to a run, new maps or levels to play runs on, but also new upgrades and items that may be found during runs. Instead of straight up increasing the power level of a player, this type of meta progression simply gives more things for players to play with in future runs, without actually increasing or decreasing the overall difficulty of future runs. This can also allow developers to hide more complex or nuanced content behind these unlockables so that players can get more comfortable first before having more choices to pick from, including potentially more complicated characters or upgrades. One way to unlock these are with permanent currencies earned during runs. Although personally, I tend not to be a huge fan of this approach, as spending currency on something unknown that doesn't actually make players stronger can be a bit underwhelming at times. Especially for games that give the player the choice to either unlock more content or get stronger using the same currency, something I personally very much dislike in pretty much any roguelite. The more common way is by achievements, whether it be completing a run with a specific character on a specific difficulty, defeating a certain amount of enemies throughout every run, or even more specific challenges like having a certain number of summoned minions at a time. Other than maybe the more specific challenges, these achievements are usually earned automatically and are great at keeping players satisfied by simply playing the game, and in turn, getting more to play with. And since unlockables don't actually impact the balance of the game, they can in some scenarios be unlocked in large amounts at a time, if given the opportunity, which can lead to very enjoyable, rewarding moments. One of my favorite aspects of Halls of Torment was the first few hours of gameplay. I would be unlocking sometimes up to 10 achievements per run. Even though I didn't fully comprehend what each of these unlocks were, it didn't matter to me as much as the thrill of seeing each run constantly progress the game further and further every time was so satisfying to me. That being said, developers do need to be careful not to oversaturate the pool of items or upgrades too much. Especially for games that lean towards players creating synergies with certain combinations, if the pool of item is filled with too many random upgrades, creating synergies can get harder and harder with each unlock, something that Potato's DLC, for instance, struggled with at its launch. Luckily enough, most Hordelikes don't tend to prioritize specific synergies in their gameplay, so this doesn't tend to be a huge issue most of the time, but definitely something to keep in mind. On the flip side, if a game does have most of its content locked behind achievements or permanent currencies, then it's important for players to still have enough to play around with on a fresh file. One key difference from other action roguelikes is that players find significantly more items during a single run in a Hordelike. This can lead to games constantly offering the same items or upgrades for the first few hours of gameplay, risking runs to feel a bit dull and repetitive prior to unlocking more options. The other meta progression are the actual enhancements. These are direct upgrades players can acquire or purchase outside of runs in order to permanently enhance their characters for every future run. Considering that Hordelikes are, once again, simple mechanically, this means that upgrades don't usually involve drastic mechanical changes. More so, enhancements are generally stat improvements such as more health, more speed, more luck, more experience, etc. Having enhancement meta progression is a great way to keep a game's length in check, preventing players from potentially starting a run, beating it on their first go, and making the potential final encounter feel underwhelming. A game that requires players to play a few runs to collect currency while slowly learning the game will give a nice sense of pacing. Especially with unlockable characters, levels, or maps, combining both meta progression styles can make a seemingly simple Hordelike into an actual adventure. Nordic Ashes may have very basic gameplay, but the fact that players are constantly getting stronger after every run while also unlocking brand new characters and brand new maps every time one has been cleared gives a great sense of pacing and adventure in this rather simple game mechanically. Not to mention that these enhancements are often quite affordable, especially in the early stages of the game. This means that players are constantly rewarded for simply playing a run while collecting currency along the way. They can then use this currency to become more powerful in future runs, which is a great feeling. While most Hordelikes do have these meta progressions, including both types often combined, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are necessary. When Potato first came out, it had unlockable characters and items, but players were playing on the same level with zero enhancements, and it was still to me one of the most enjoyable Hordelike experiences. The thing about Potato though is that the gameplay and different characters are extremely enjoyable on their own. If developers decide to have a limited amount of different meta progression, then I'd probably recommend making sure that the gameplay is very enjoyable and satisfying on its own. A rather challenging goal in a genre so mechanically limited. While level design might seem like a small topic in this genre, considering that some games just have a square as their level, I actually think that maps in Hordelikes have gotten more and more interesting as the years go by. Yes, Potato is just a square, with absolutely nothing else to interact with, but again, the game's polished, fast-paced gameplay doesn't keep it from getting dull, especially with a simple yet effective mechanic of trees spawning around the map, giving a reason for players to run around. But there are now many more ways to do interesting level design in Hordelikes. While some may indeed be constrained to a closed area, some instead have infinite maps, allowing players to go any direction as far as they want. This can provide a strong sense of immersion, making the player feel as if they're exploring an entire world rather than just a confined space. Considering that enemies usually spawn on the player's current screen and that the goal is to destroy said enemies, it doesn't really matter where a player is in comparison to the overall map. Decorative tiles or background elements, along with occasional random obstacles or collectible items, are quite easy to spawn in a game where the player character is generally always centered on the screen. Speaking of grabbables or collectibles, while levels themselves may be fairly empty, there are usually always a few things to pick up along the way. Breakable boxes or barrel-like items that can drop currency, health, temporary power-ups such as invincibility, damage ups, or even the notorious magnet-style effect that sucks up any missed experience or money. A common item that is always very satisfying. While none of these are particularly unique or very impactful to the overall run, they give a good reason for players to move around the map instead of just hanging out in one spot. Death Must Die even has unique events that can be encountered, which are generally really fun and engaging, pushing players to really explore, a rare, exciting feeling I haven't seen many other Hordelikes do successfully. But whether levels are endless or constrained, having a reason for players to move around outside of simply needing to evade enemies and collecting XP can be a nice addition, even if it's not a major element to the game. In my opinion, one of the many reasons Vampire Survivors was so successful was thanks to its unique level design, something that many other Hordelikes don't often try to replicate or reference, which is rather ironic given that that game started the entire genre trend. Each map is unique with different backgrounds accompanied by different enemies, some infinite length, others not, as well as multiple secrets scattered across the different maps, creating a fantastic sense of adventure that I have yet to encounter again in other Hordelikes. The first time I discovered that book in Halls of Torment, which told me to follow trails of blood, leading to bone altars, all accumulating to the acquisition of a mysterious stone, was such a fun element of the game that kept me engaged as I was constantly wondering which other secrets I could find in this game. Spoiler alert, it wasn't as much as I would have hoped for, but either way, I was just happy to finally find another Hordelike with actual secrets that pushed me to want to explore and ultimately play more. It's funny how a genre that is centered around defeating hordes of enemies tend to have rather simple enemy design. With the primary focus of Hordelikes being simplicity and satisfying gameplay, having large amounts of enemies constantly surrounding the player means that most of them need to be simple and overall easy to deal with, as to not overwhelm players with actually needing to keep track of every enemy. I'd say that over 70% of enemies players encounter will generally just be some sort of punching bag with no attacks or actions other than slowly moving towards the player. Their role is to allow players to utilize their abilities to effortlessly eliminate them and easily gather resources with minimal effort. Considering that the joy of Hordelikes is clearing hordes of enemies with impressive attacks, it's important for most enemies to be cleared with ease. This means that when starting a new run, every enemy on screen should just be viewed as roaming loot more than actual threats. Even after the first few minutes, most new enemies may actually be the same kind of enemy, but with more health, as well as increased or decreased speed. These enemy variations will usually be visually different from the first encountered enemies to give a sense of progression through the run without actually adding much more unique enemy design. That by itself may be the bulk of most enemies in a Hordelike. By simply changing health value, a speed value, and switching the sprites, you've got yourself a brand new enemy with low effort, showing once again how simple it can be designing these games. Some enemies may not even use new sprites and may instead reuse previous ones, and adjusting the color palettes or even just increasing the size of the sprite to create new enemies with even less effort. This may sound lazy, and in some ways it very much is, but reusing sprites in games isn't a new thing, and if done sparingly in conjunction with already a good amount of content, can be a simple addition to add more quote-unquote simple diversity in the enemies. Now, even though these may be the bulk of most enemies in Hordelikes, this doesn't mean that there aren't more interesting enemy designs as well. While definitely in the minority, it's generally a good idea to have certain enemies with unique mechanics, especially in the mid to late game portion of a run. But whatever additional mechanics enemies may have, it's usually a good idea to limit them to just a single new variable each. These new mechanics can be done in many ways. Enemies that shoot one bullet at a time, enemies with actual attacks usually indicated by a marker on the ground players need to react to, enemies that explode upon death, potentially even clearing other enemies with them along the way. Outside of the Horde-like genre, these may sound rather basic, but once again, with simplicity being the priority, these enemies usually add the right amount of variety, forcing players to react ever so slightly differently while still keeping the overall gameplay fairly casual. Having too many unique enemies mechanically at once on screen may add too much confusion and may take away from the enjoyment of just watching your character destroy the horde of enemies. Another element I find important is to have enemy variety appear in waves. Even if players are to encounter, say, 15 different enemies throughout a run, not having them appear all at once is important for a few reasons. Not only does having new enemies appear every now and then, while removing old ones may help with the overall pacing, having only a few different enemies at all times on the screen helps to not overwhelm the player. Especially when adding enemies with unique mechanics, having a few of them on screen at all times I think is important, as to not force players to be paying attention to each individual variation at all times. 20 Minutes Till Dawn, for instance, may not have a crazy amount of enemy variation, but every few minutes or so will introduce a new enemy type that players now need to adjust to, even if they are simple enemies with different speed and health nominators. This can keep the run structured and even let experienced players plan their run accordingly by being able to expect what comes next. So those are generic enemy designs, but there can also be elites and even bosses. Many games may add elite enemies as an additional enemy type. These usually take longer to defeat, rewarding players with more currency or even a free item or upgrade. The beauty of having these enemy types is that they tend to be very simple to design and implement while being very enjoyable to encounter. In many cases, elites are once again simply reusing sprites from another basic enemy, cranking the health up by a substantial amount, maybe adding one additional mechanic, and you now have a target players can focus on for greater rewards. A simple yet effective way to add excitement during a run. Bosses, on the other hand, are a different story. These can take many forms, and usually require much more work to implement, as reusing previous sprites can feel much cheaper in this instance. A lot of times, bosses will have multiple unique attacks and will generally be a must-kill for the player. In many cases, bosses will appear as the final challenge at the end of a run. And while I do enjoy the feeling of having a run build up to a different kind of fight than everything leading up to it, I find that Hordelikes that have major boss fights can easily struggle to balance the fight accordingly. Considering that 99% of Horde-like gameplay is focused on defeating multiple enemies in quick succession, major boss fights are in some ways the polar opposite. Switching gameplay for a final encounter isn't inherently a bad thing, but the issue can usually come in the form of the upgrades gathered up to then, a lot of times not being designed against bosses. Single target upgrades are generally not a huge priority compared to area of effect upgrades, since dealing 1000 damage to a single enemy is probably not as important as dealing 100 to 10 of them when surrounded by hordes of these enemies. This is why I usually recommend boss fights to also be accompanied by small enemies, as to still let every upgrade be used to some capacity even for a boss fight, especially if games have on-death effect upgrades. Arkane's gameplay, for instance, is very enjoyable and has very unique bosses, but those bosses usually come in the form of just one big enemy, making certain upgrades very weak or even useless during the fight. Adding simple enemies during the fight would allow any upgrade an even chance to shine during bosses, as well as during the regular portion of the run. In general, while bosses should obviously be taken more seriously than other enemies, making sure that they don't strive away from the overall main gameplay too much is in my eyes a good idea to keep track of. In general, talking about audio visuals for a subgenre can be pretty subjective, especially considering the limitations independent games often have to face. But that doesn't mean that there aren't specific aspects that I find important to implement in Hordelikes a majority of the time. In my experience, one of the trickiest elements in these games is balancing the satisfying visual chaos while still keeping the gameplay clear and comprehensive. In general, top-down games are better at doing this than other camera angles, since there's only one dimension to focus on. Third-person, 2.5D games or first-person Hordelikes will inherently be dealing with a slight handicap that I often find noticeable. Hitboxes are much more evident in the 2D environment, as it's much easier to, for instance, add actual strokes to sprites, whether it be the player model, enemies, or bullets. Considering that players are limited to minimal movement options, avoiding enemy hurt boxes is generally much less evident in a three-dimensional environment. This doesn't mean that it isn't possible to make a clear 3D environment for a Hordelike, it's just more challenging to do right in my experience. As for VFX, or visual effects, they're always important no matter the game, but when looking at Hordelikes, many generic VFX you've seen countless times in other games may be present in much larger quantities at the same time. If a weapon were to create a slashing V effect upon contact on an enemy, if it were to hit 20 enemies at the same time, that effect would trigger 20 times, which is, well, a lot. This is why it's important to make sure that VFX are not only satisfying but also look good alone as well as in groups, while also making sure things are still clear, as previously stated, as to not get lost in a horde of slashing visual effects. And same goes for death animations. Considering that enemies are to be defeated in large quantities in quick succession, having a simple yet satisfying death animation is good to have. As for audio, what I'd note is fairly similar to visuals. While audio chaos can be funny and enjoyably ridiculous, too much too often can run the risk of getting pretty annoying, especially if a lot of these sounds are in the higher frequency registration. Hearing multiple high-pitched sound effects in quick succession is generally more triggering than lower tones. That being said, I do find enemy death sounds pretty enjoyable even in large quantities if done well and isn't too excessive. A game where I destroy a bunch of enemies but without getting any feedback of their death can make it feel less earned and sometimes even lonely. For games that have XP or currency collecting, having a satisfying sound effect for collecting them is in my eyes very important. I find progressively ascending sounds to be very effective, where the more you collect currency in quick succession, the higher the pitch, which rewards players for collecting large quantities of currencies and make magnet power-ups even more satisfying than they already are. In conclusion, I think Hordelikes are a great and simple niche part of the action roguelike genre that keeps players of any level engaged thanks to their simple and satisfying gameplay. It's a genre focused on the feeling of being surrounded by enemies and decimating them all with ease and minimal effort. Whether it be first person, 2D, top-down, Hordelikes are niche but allow a lot of unique designs to be created with simple mechanics and a simple goal of destroying hordes of enemies. If you like this kind of content, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And thanks for watching.